Collyns Fellowship. She contributed importantly to the evaluation, including an excellent paper on the history of bank funds collaboration, which I recommend to you. We're also joined by 3 other very distinguished scholars of global economic governance as panelists. But first, before I turn over to Tammy, let me just say a few words about the Independent Evaluation Office. I believe that the IEO is now recognized as a critical component of the governance structure of the IMF. We were set up 20 years ago in the wake of the Asia crisis, which was a crisis not just for Asia, but also a crisis for the IMF's legitimacy and credibility. So our task is to conduct independent evaluations of IMF policies, practices, and activities with 3 purposes. First, to support the oversight function of the executive board. Second, to strengthen the IMF's institutional learning from its experience. And third, to increase the IMF's transparency and legitimacy. I think in each of these ways, we have made a really substantial contribution to the IMF's capacity to deliver on its mandate. I would highlight 2 particular aspects of our structure that help us to be effective. First, we are completely independent of management and staff. We have an arm's length relationship with the executive board. In the end, it's up to us to decide what we wish to evaluate and what conclusions and recommendations we reach. Second, there's a robust follow-up process in place for our evaluations. Our aim is really to help catalyze change, help the fund do its job better, not just to write a nice report that sits on a shelf. Thus, following the evaluation being completed, it's discussed at the board, and then management and staff need to prepare a concrete implementation plan to deliver on the recommendations that we have made that have been endorsed by the executive board. This implementation plan has to be approved by the board and then is carefully monitored. The report we'll discuss today is the first to look squarely at how well the IMF collaborates with its closest partner, the World Bank. The importance of effective collaboration among international agencies is increasingly recognized as critical as the international community strives to address common issues such as climate, health, and poverty. This is a very clear message from the G20's Eminent Persons Group on global financial governance a couple of years ago. In practice, however, collaboration between large, powerful agencies like the fund and the bank has been problematic and raised concerns that the full benefits of the work are not being realized, as synergies are not being maximized, and cost efficiencies are not being realized. And this concern was a key motivation for launching this evaluation. We chose to focus on one particular aspect of collaboration with the World Bank on macrostructural issues, but we believe that there are larger lessons to be drawn, and we hope that the evaluation will contribute to greater commitment at the fund and the bank to working together effectively. I'll now turn the session over to our moderator, Tammy, but before I do that, I'll just mention that the session is being recorded and we will be posting it on our website. Thanks very much, and over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Charles. It was a great privilege for me to have this Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship and to be able to spend it at the IEO and as a member of this team. It was an invaluable experience for me, and I was fortunate to work with such an impressive team. I'm very pleased that my home institution, SIS, is holding this seminar with IEO, and I want to welcome the audience as well. In my area of work, it's exciting to me when scholars and major IOs, international organizations, can interact and engage with one another to grapple with and advance our understanding of important issues. So I'm hoping for a good discussion today with our audience, some of whom are academics. There's some students in the crowd as well. Just to give this a bit of my own framing, collaboration between international organizations and IOs and other actors is a very important topic, but not a new phenomenon. IOs have always collaborated with each other in some way, but collaboration and partnership have become more popular strategies with IOs and many other actors in recent years, given budget constraints, a rising number of complex problems that no one actor can address alone, and a widespread perception that collaboration produces better outcomes, whether it's in terms of substance or cost or other measures of efficiency. Many practitioners and scholars assume collaboration is a good idea, but once you dig into it, you really get a sense of how complex it is. Many institutions don't really define what they mean by collaboration and how it might differ from coordination or consultation or cooperation. There are power asymmetries among organizations. Some benefit more from working together than others. And as we've learned in the process of this evaluation, it's one thing to want it, but it's another thing to figure out when and how to do it well, hence our evaluation. So without further ado, let me make the other introductions. Michael Kell, our IEO advisor and team leader of the evaluation, will introduce the other members of the team and present the main points of the evaluation. Michael joined the IEO in early 2019 after serving as chief economist and director of value for money studies on energy and environmental policy at the UK National Audit Office. We'll then turn to our panel of three leading experts on the IMF and IFIs and global economic governance. We have three political scientists. Dr. Miles Kahler is Distinguished Professor at SIS and a Senior Fellow of Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's published widely in the fields of international politics and international political economy, including on global governance, international financial institutions, and Asia-Pacific regionalism. His current research projects include the development of institutions of complex global governance, the changing role of emerging economies in world politics and global governance, and sources of cosmopolitanism and parochialism in contemporary politics. Then we'll turn to Dr. Randall Henning. Randy is a professor of international economic relations at SIS. He specializes in international and comparative political economy, global governance, and regional integration. His research addresses institutional collaboration in a book on the Euro crisis, where he investigates the fund's relationship to the European institutions, and a recent report on IMF and regional financial arrangements. He's currently spearheading a comparative academic project on international regime complexes, which includes examination of the fund, the bank, and other international financial institutions. And I'm very pleased also to have here Dr. Bessma Momani, who's a full professor in the Department of Political Science and Assistant Vice President, Research and International in the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C., and also a Fulbright scholar. Her research has focused on international affairs, diversity and inclusion, Middle East affairs, and the global economy. Just one last logistic before I turn the floor over to Michael. Please enter your questions in the chat box, and I'll look through them and pose them to the panelists. And if you have a question for one of the particular panelists or Michael, you may specify that as well. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tammy. Let me just start by introducing the other members of the IEO team, apart from Tammy and myself. They were Llewellyn Steadman, Elisa Abrams, and Roxana Pedralio. Okay. So, just to set out in a little more detail what our evaluation looked at. It focused on IMF World Bank collaboration in the context of 4 pilot schemes, which were run by the fund between 2015 and 2019. And those were aimed at exploring how best to integrate macrostructural issues into IMF surveillance. And those 4 pilots covered inequality, gender, climate change and energy issues, and macrostructural reforms more broadly. We also considered some longer standing areas of bank fund collaboration, such as joint working on debt, tax and financial surveillance. And while the focus of the evaluation was on IMF collaboration with the World Bank, we also looked to draw lessons from the IMF's work with other partners, in particular with the OECD, the ILO, the WTO and UN Women. It's worth clarifying what the evaluation didn't cover. It was not intended to be a comprehensive evaluation of all aspects of BFC. A lot of joint work between the bank and fund, of course, happens in the context of IMF programs with low-income countries. And while we inevitably heard perspectives from stakeholders on collaboration in that context, it wasn't our focus. The evaluation also didn't attempt to systematically evaluate the quality and impact of IMF work on macrostructural issues per se, but rather tried to understand whether collaboration with the bank enhanced the quality and impact of the fund's work on macrostructural issues which were done under the 4 pilots. And finally, we weren't evaluating the bank collaboration with the fund. Our remit in the IEO only extends to the IMF, but we did, of course, seek bank perspectives on fund collaboration from members of the bank. The main reason for this somewhat restricted scope is that this was the first of a new, shorter format for IEO evaluations which we're currently trialling. Traditionally, IEO evaluations take 18 to 24 months and involve a number of external consultants who produce 10 to 15 background papers. But under the shorter format, we aim to complete the report in around only 12 months and rely less on external consultants. These shorter evaluations may or may not make recommendations, depending on the findings and our judgment about the potential value of recommendations. There's also an overall constraint of no more than 2 new implementation plans in response to IEO reports each year. So let me just say a little bit more about the reasons why the IEO decided to look at this topic. As Charles said, bank fund collaboration has become increasingly important as the fund has looked to enhance its focus on macrostructural issues such as inequality and the drivers of growth following the global financial crisis. There has been no formal review of bank fund joint working since 2010, and since then several other IEO evaluations have identified shortcomings in aspects of bank fund collaboration. The IMF board has long been interested in bank fund collaboration, and increasingly so with the fund's growing attention on macro-critical structural issues. In particular, the board is interested to understand whether collaboration with the bank and others has allowed the fund to move into new areas while operating within a flat real budget. More specifically, our evaluation was timed to feed into the next periodic review of fund surveillance, which prior to the COVID crisis was due to take place in mid-2020, but is now expected to come to the IMF board in the spring. The key questions for the evaluation. First, what were the fund's intentions for collaboration? Second, how did it operationalize those intentions? Third, what collaboration took place? Fourth, was that collaboration effective in terms of quality, influence, and efficiency? Sixth, what are the factors that support or hinder external collaboration? And finally, what lessons are there for the fund to strengthen collaboration? Let me just say a little bit about the history of bank fund collaboration, and this is the subject of Tammy's background paper. First point, just to emphasize, is that collaboration with the bank and other related international organizations is baked into the Articles of Agreement of both the fund and the bank. Tammy's heroic work in the archives unearthed at least 25 agreements between the fund and the bank since the 1940s. And we categorize those into 4 broad types. So I think the slides are maybe catching up with me now. Apologies for this. Let me try again.
Hi, sorry, Michael. What slide should you be on? It seems I might have to put.
Okay, should be on slide 6, Josh, please. Okay, so apologies for this. Josh, you've got control of the slides, have you?
Apparently, sorry.
That's fine. I'll tell you when to move on.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, so Tammy unearthed at least 25 agreements between the bank and the fund since the 1940s, and those we categorize into 4 broad types. Agreements that emphasised information sharing, and that was typified by the first formal agreement between the bank and the fund in 1946. Agreements which focus more on the demarcation of responsibilities between the two institutions, and those type of agreements started to emerge in the 1960s as the two institutions expanded their membership rapidly, and that type of agreement culminated in the 1989 Concordat, which is still the formal basis at the institutional level of collaboration between the bank and the fund. Subsequent to that, there was more of an emphasis on joint working and complementarity in areas of shared responsibility, and that was typified by the Milan report, which came out in 2007, which was focused on bank-fund collaboration. And then finally, more recently, the focus of the formal agreements has been around joint frameworks for specific issues. For example, the HIPC initiative, financial sector assessment programs, FSAPs, and more recently, the joint framework for assessing debt vulnerabilities. Next slide, please, Josh. As Tammy mentioned at the start, it's quite difficult to track down formal definitions of collaboration, particularly certainly on the fund side. And reverting to sort of standard dictionary definitions, as I've put on the screen there, doesn't really clarify things much. So in practice, we tended to identify the range of activities which characterized the collaboration that happened. So based on fund internal reports to management and guidance notes for staff, we identified, as I say, a range of activities that constituted collaboration. And these can be roughly ranked in terms of increasing degrees of depth, starting at the minimal end with the fund drawing on bank publications and data, through to informal discussions between bank and fund country-facing teams, to co-authoring background papers with bank experts, through to joint missions and joint meetings with member countries, through to more structured collaboration using common assessment frameworks and resulting in joint reports. For example, the Debt Sustainability Assessment, DSAs, and FSAPs. Next slide, please, Josh. We used a pretty standard set of methods, including separate surveys of bank and fund staff with a common structure and some common questions. The response rate to these surveys was low, but we drew on some of the results where they triangulated with other evidence sources and where they helped us give some quantification. Next slide, please, Josh. So collaboration, of course, is not something that's easy to quantify, but we developed a few simple metrics. We were able, of course, to quantify survey responses, but we also analysed citations in a range of IMF published documents to see how often the fund referenced bank publications versus other fund publications, academic papers, and other sources. As another exercise, we assigned scores on a 5-point scale to the content and quality of annexes to IMF Article 4 surveillance reports, and those annexes are meant to summarise the fund's collaboration with the bank on that particular country. Next slide. I just want to say a little bit about what we heard from the people that we interviewed about the benefits of collaboration, and I think those benefits broadly fall into three types. Fund and bank staff tended to emphasise that bank-fund collaboration helps credibility interactions of both institutions with the authorities of member countries through promoting consistency of advice and avoiding conflicting advice. Most of the IMF board members that we interviewed and country authorities stressed that collaboration should help operational efficiency, and Tammy mentioned that as one of the motivations for collaboration. And then I think it's just worth adding that some board members and country officials that we talked to noted that collaboration between IFIs supports the credibility and effectiveness of the multilateral system more broadly, and therefore has the attributes of a global public good. Turning then to our key findings. Overall, we concluded that bank fund collaboration on macrostructural issues has been broad but uneven. Informal collaboration is widespread, but aspirations that the fund would systematically leverage bank expertise were not achieved, and there was little deep collaboration in the form of joint outputs. Second, fund macrostructural work is generally well regarded by the bank and other experts, but we found little evidence that its quality and impact were greatly enhanced by BFC. We also found no strong evidence that collaboration resulted in cost savings for the fund, and some indications that it added to workloads. Third, we found some cases of mixed messages on shared issues and missed opportunities to exploit synergies, suggesting that collaboration was not as extensive as it should have been. And fourth, we found that benefits of collaboration were clearer in some of the fund's other partnerships, such as with UN Women on gender issues in some African countries. We found that the unevenness of collaboration on macrostructural issues reflects a number of factors. Firstly, the fact that the fund took a rather decentralized approach to the 4 pilots, leaving a lot of discretion to country teams as to whether and how they collaborated. Quite a few teams decided they wouldn't prioritize external collaboration and instead relied on expertise in the fund. This was appropriate on some issues. For example, where the country team decided to focus on energy subsidies, which is a topic where the fund has extensive expertise. But it also seemed to us to reflect a cultural tendency in the fund towards self-reliance and a reluctance to look outside for relevant expertise. Some fund teams did actively seek input from the bank, often reflecting idiosyncratic factors such as the working styles and preferences of the IMF mission chief or coincidental timing of bank work, which incentivized both sides to work together. The unevenness of collaboration also reflected the perceived challenges of working with the bank, such as finding the right people and aligning institutional timetables and clearance protocols. But fourth, there was little systematic consideration on the part of the fund as to the incentives and constraints on bank staff to work with the fund. We heard from a number of bank staff that they felt they had little to gain from devoting time to working with the fund on the fund's agenda. Excuse me. Looking beyond macrostructural work under the 4 pilots, we found that bank-fund collaboration varies widely across policy areas. Where it's deep and generally effective, for example on debt and financial sector issues, this reflects 3 main factors. First, clear messages from shareholders about the importance of bank and fund working together on particular issues. Second, clear mutual benefits from collaboration. And third, well-defined roles within tailored frameworks that have been adapted over time. So here are the main lessons that we identified. First, collaboration can bring benefits, but it's also often difficult and can be costly in terms of time and effort. It's certainly not a panacea for addressing resource constraints. Second, therefore, the objective is not more collaboration always and everywhere. Rather, the fund should identify the areas where returns to collaboration are likely to be the highest, based on an understanding of the business needs of its potential partners and the resource implications for the fund. Third, frameworks for collaboration can be important, but should be tailored to each issue. And we don't see a case for revising the Concordat. As I mentioned, that's the high-level framework for bank collaboration, which has been in place since 1989. Fourth, while personalities and chemistry will always matter for effective collaboration, nonetheless, incentives and culture can influence behavior. The 5th lesson we drew was that bank fund collaboration would be facilitated by easier access to basic information, for example, where to find experts, and to curated knowledge bases. 6th, for collaboration to be effective and to manage the potential risks to the fund's reputation of relying on expertise from outside the institution, the fund needs some minimum level of in-house expertise on macrostructural issues. We found on climate, for example, that collaboration with the bank was constrained by the very limited number of IMF staff working on that issue, at least until recently. And finally, management's commitment to engage with partners is critical, and the IMF board could also do more to help bank fund collaboration. Which brings me to our recommendations. The IEO tries to be parsimonious in its recommendations and restrict itself to 4 or 5 key areas for reform, with some suggestions for specific steps. But it's for IMF staff and management to propose concrete measures as part of an implementation plan, which they develop after the board has considered the IEO's report and its recommendations. So our 4 recommendations are, first, that for those areas where collaboration is judged to bring the greatest returns, the fund should develop and agree tailored frameworks for collaboration with partners. We further suggest that climate change is one area well suited to this, as it's an issue of increasing importance to the fund and one where the bank has deep and complementary expertise, but where that expertise is widely dispersed across the bank, it can be difficult for the fund to access. Second, The fund should actively consider how to improve incentives for its staff to collaborate externally and address the cultural reluctance to look outside for help. Third, the fund should work with the bank to find ways to improve exchange of knowledge. And fourth, the fund board should strengthen its role in facilitating collaboration through its oversight role, its scope to influence staff behaviour, and its direct engagement with the bank board. Next slide, please, Josh. So our report was about to be discussed by the IMF board just before the COVID crisis erupted back in March. As a result, the board discussion was deferred until November 2020. Prior to that discussion, the IMF Managing Director issued a written response which indicated her broad agreement with the key messages of the report and a broad support for our recommendations, albeit with qualifications which were mainly to highlight that implementation would depend on reaching agreement with the bank. At the IMF board meeting on November 16th to discuss the report, fund executive directors fully endorsed the key findings of our report. They recognised that enhancing the effectiveness of collaboration hinges on agreement with the bank, but urged, quotes, active engagement, end quotes, by fund management and staff. Directors unanimously supported our recommendations, and some directors furthermore proposed the establishment of a high-level joint management committee to provide strategic guidance and impetus. The key next steps will be the comprehensive surveillance review, which is due to come to the IMF board in the spring, and will be an opportunity for IMF staff and management to reflect the key messages of our report in the forward plan for IMF surveillance over the medium term. IMF staff will then have to develop a management implementation plan with specific steps to take forward our recommendations. We expect this to come to the board for their recommendation within 6 months of the board meeting. And then progress against the agreed implementation plan is then subject to periodic review by the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We will turn now to our panelists, and excuse me, after that we'll open the floor to questions and comments. We don't have a huge audience, so I think it might work well if people ask their own questions. You can click the raise hand. We'll try that out, but you can also post your comment or question in the chat box. So I will now turn the floor over to Miles.
Thank you. And thanks to the IEO for inviting me to participate in this panel, and to you, Tammy, my colleague who was a member of the team and organized the panel. I've used the IEO reports in my courses and my research. I've always found them objective, clear, and valuable, even though they're not always appreciated by the IMF management and staff, which of course means that the IEO is probably doing its job. So my first observation on the report is that it understates its significance. One has to delve into the report to find out that its subject matter concerns IMF World Bank collaboration on issues of central global importance, defined in the report as inequality, gender, energy, climate, and macrostructural issues. In the case of climate, many would argue this is an existential issue, and each of the other issues is central to global economic and social well-being. They are also issues which require many sectors of knowledge: scientific, economic, political, and participation in behavioral change on the part of a host of actors beyond national governments in order to achieve desired global outcomes. They are not issues that are likely to find resolution within the confines of any single international organization. Indeed, they blur the boundaries of conventional issue areas within international politics. So one conclusion is that there are considerable benefits from specialization and division of labor, so long as there are means to bring together that specialized expertise in order to move policies in the desired direction. Cooperation or collaboration between the World Bank and the IMF, and between those organizations and other international organizations, outside experts, civil society organizations, other actors, is essential for progress on these issues and for maintaining confidence in the multilateral system overall, something that is mentioned in the report. So successful collaboration really is an influence multiplier for these organizations and their partners. Second observation, the checkered record of collaboration between the fund and the bank over time, which the report details, and Tammy Gutner's very excellent historical paper details and gives even more detail on. The checkered record is not surprising. It is the story of most modern organizations that are called upon by their leaders or by outsiders to collaborate. We live in a world of siloed, hierarchical organizations, And despite persistent calls for bridges between those silos, those bridges are typically fragile and transient for reasons that the report outlines. To give only one example, the report could well have been written about modern universities, in which any provost will recount in despairing terms the difficulty in obtaining cross-departmental or cross-faculty collaboration when the value of that collaboration is patently obvious to the provost. Third, looking back on the history of fund-bank collaboration and the report's evaluation of the pilot projects, what does the report recommend? I would say they consider three options. The first, macro, if you will, top-down. Second, meso or lateral, and micro or individual level types of collaboration. On the first level, which is not given a great deal of attention in the report, I think the report correctly argues there is no need for another top-level concordat or joint management action plan, although it emphasizes the importance of board support and oversight. And that seems to have been backed up by the reaction of the board to the report. However, despite the claims by executive board members who were interviewed that they wish to be more engaged, one must wonder whether, given its other oversight responsibilities, the executive board would assign fund bank cooperation a very high priority in its deliberations in the future. And that remains to be seen, obviously, but I must say I'm a little skeptical. Second, the meso level. That receives the most attention in the report because it is evaluating the pilot projects, which are these lateral efforts at collaboration launched since 2014. It was a highly decentralized set of projects. They were centered on collaboration by mid-level staff. And instead of this decentralized model, which had at best mixed results, the IEO team recommends a more structured approach with a formal framework for cooperation that is described in the report as a means of addressing the shortcomings of these pilots. And those recommendations included in the report in recommendation number 1 primarily seem sensible to me, an effort to focus collaboration where it is most valuable and likeliest to succeed. I would note, however, that throughout the report, a prime motivation for cooperation seems to be efficiency, at least viewed from the fund side of collaboration. In other words, in an era of tight resources, the fund should rely on the bank and other partners for expertise that it has an inadequate supply. But as the report correctly notes, however, awarding this motivation such a prominent place risks identifying partners in the bank and elsewhere as simply an assemblage of unpaid consultants. And one very useful conclusion from the report is that the fund must make a contribution of its own to any partnership, and that requires building its own expertise, at least to a limited degree. And I would underscore this conclusion in the report, on building its expertise on these globally important issues. Partners will ask, and well, they should ask, what is the fund bringing to its partnership? And so far, it seems, and here I'm quoting from the report itself, the ability to access and influence decision makers in finance ministries or central banks. Well, that may get them some distance, the fund some distance in building partnerships, but that seems a fairly limited contribution. And it seems to me there's going to have to be more building of expertise within the fund. And that means that the efficiency or the resource constraint issue that is prominent in the report may have to be lowered in terms of its priority for collaboration. What is most striking in the report's findings, however, is at the next level, or the final level of collaboration, the micro or individual level, because it's striking to me, based on the survey evidence recounted in the report, that there appears to be a considerable amount of cooperation underway between the bank and the fund at this level, between individuals in either organization, informal, perhaps episodic, but valuable nonetheless. Over and over again, the informants in the report make clear that individuals matter. In its recommendations, the report does touch on this level of collaboration, but I wish that the authors, rather than treating the conditions for individual collaboration as largely idiosyncratic, had been more ambitious in building on what has worked. For example, determining who are these expert cooperators or collaborators, these kind of collaborator Sherpas, I would call them, and map their networks and how they sustain those networks and whether others could learn from their experience. Recommendation number 2 in the report incorporates some of this micro-level success by arguing for incorporating this success in inter-organization cooperation into individual performance assessments, which I think is a very good idea, although I have to say that recommendation is full of HR-type jargon, and I can imagine the HR part of the fund will have all kinds of difficulties with incorporating this, but nevertheless, they mention that core staff can serve as focal points for external engagement, and I think this should really be elevated going forward in terms of collaboration. In this respect, collaboration between these two organizations resembles the web of collaboration that produces beneficial action across government agencies within, for example, the US government, between university departments, across international borders as well, as we know from studying transgovernmental networks such as the central bank network. So saying individuals matter doesn't mean that it's all idiosyncratic. It means that one should build on that individual expertise, it seems to me, to construct future collaborative networks. Final observation, these very complex and globally important issues will require partnerships between the fund, the bank, and other international organizations with a widening array of actors that have knowledge of their own, whether expert or local. And I do hope that the IEO will devote a future report to the ways in which those partnerships can be developed and sustained. But congratulations on the report. I found it really very interesting, and basically the recommendations extremely sensible. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Miles, for your thoughtful comments. I'll turn the floor over to Randy Henning now.
Okay, Tammy, thank you very much. And thank you to Charles, too, for organizing this webinar and for the opportunity to comment on the evaluation. Collaboration between the bank and the fund is a subject that moves in cycles. There have been about 5 or 6 of these cycles over the last 75 years, as kind of overviewed in Michael's presentation. But as also said there, it's been more than a decade since a comprehensive review. And so this evaluation report is very welcome. My research addresses international financial institutions in the context of regime complexes, clusters of institutions that are often overlapping, sometimes competing, and the cooperation and competition that emerges within these complexes. So I approach this topic comparatively from the standpoint of lessons from the operation of the Troika in the Euro crisis and from the experience with relations between the fund and the regional financial arrangements. IEO has invited a group of academics like us to address the report in the hope that we might provide some concepts and principles that are helpful in understanding bank-fund collaboration in the broader context of global governance, and that could be helpful in advancing the implementation of the report going forward. So my comments will take a step back from the report to highlight the conceptual toolkit and some of the arguments, and then a step forward to apply these to possibilities for implementation. So in the conceptual toolkit, I'd like to address 2 types of distinctions. The first of these is among the different types of collaboration, right? So that term, collaboration, is used as an umbrella concept in the overall report, but it's unpacked in the historical review that Tammy offers in her background paper for the project. And I think the distinctions are really very important to implementation strategies because each institution's incentives to collaborate vary depending on whether collaboration involves information exchange, whether it's a synchronization of messaging, a joint study of thematic issues, coordinated programs, or the joint programs. And the strategies need to be sensitive to these differences. So the second distinction that I'd like to emphasize and then elaborate a little bit on in my argument is between ex ante and ex post collaboration. So ex ante collaboration kind of sets up in advance mechanisms to preempt conflict or kind of facilitate joint work among these institutions. Ex post collaboration happens in the clutch, so to speak, right? Once conflicts have already emerged, say, for example, in the heat of a program negotiation. So the difference is important here because some institutions and critically some key member states want collaboration even though they're not proactive about it in setting it up ahead of time, right? And the reasons for this can be important to identifying pitfalls and the pathways for implementation. So my argument is that key member states tolerate and encourage overlap in mission and capabilities among the institutions. I'm speaking generally, not just about the bank and the fund. They do this for a variety of reasons, even though, right, dissidence and conflict among the institutions might be predictable. So key members can afford to be complacent about such conflicts and the interference that they produce when these states are in a position to mediate interinstitutional disputes that rise to a level that threatens important goals. This mediation, right, is an opportunity to put their thumb on the scale and tilt outcomes toward their preferences. So for them, these key member states, institutional conflict can be part of a strategy to control agency drift, the term in the literature that we use to describe movement on the part of secretariats away from the preferences of key members and executive boards. So Germany used the involvement of the International Monetary Fund to restrain the European Commission during the Euro crisis in this way, for example. So this strategy is not functionally optimal, right? But key member states sometimes prioritize other objectives instead. And creating mechanisms of ex-ante collaboration would disintermediate these governments from the conflict resolution process, which could attenuate control and therefore may be unwelcome. For this reason, right, ex-ante mechanisms are chronically undersupplied as a general matter in global governance, and institutional conflict is often resolved instead in ad hoc, informal ways in the clutch, ex post. So whether this dynamic, right, applies to macrostructural issues in the context of the bank and the fund, that would be an important question. To the extent that it does, and I think it certainly does, at least in part, the logic suggests that the advocates of collaboration kind of examine ways to reassure governments that control will not slip away as the conversation between staff and management of the two institutions deepens. So those ways could involve a couple of things. First of all, it could involve looping in members, right, and at an early point in staff collaboration. So pages 22 and 30 of the evaluation can report frustration by executive directors that they're not informed as early as they'd like to be. So second, giving executive directors more opportunities to weigh in all along the way as collaboration evolves and a third way is to secure executive board buy-in through joint meetings of the two boards as has been proposed, right? So indeed I agree that such a meeting, a joint meeting of the two executive boards could be very constructive in a number of different ways. But prior to such a meeting, I think it really is important to develop a robust answer to the question that's been highlighted by Miles and by Michael and in several other commentaries on this report. What is in it for the World Bank, right? Why isn't collaboration, right, simply cost-saving research assistance for the International Monetary Fund, right? To pose the question sharply, and I think a compelling answer exists, right? But it lies outside the scope of macrostructural issues, probably, right? So I understand that IEO chose to focus on these issues in order to conform to the quicker, shorter format for the reports. But the payoff for the bank lies in programs and policy-based lending. Because it's there where IMF action helps or perhaps hinders the achievement of the bank's development goals for our client borrowers, right? So here, it may not help to abandon umbrella agreements between the two institutions in favor of a series of task-specific collaboration agreements, since the broader agreements open up the space for a multilateral clearing, if you will, of the costs and benefits across the separate narrow areas of collaboration. Nonetheless, even if we stick to this task-specific collaboration strategy, right, there could be plenty of scope for collaboration on macrostructural issues in the program context, since these issues are by definition critical to program design. So I'd recommend that IEO and the independent evaluation group of the bank conduct a joint study of bank fund collaboration on macrostructural issues in the program context. Right? The executive boards of both institutions can task them to do so at either separate meetings or preferably in that joint meeting that has been proposed. So another project for collaboration, as an elaboration on lesson number two in the report, though perhaps also somewhat paradoxically, right, could be to identify those areas where collaboration is not necessary, right? That is, the areas where the activities of the two institutions are naturally reinforcing, or where country directors can cooperate informally on their own. And indeed, there might even be areas, dare I say, where competition could even be desirable, right? Where progress on thematic issues, for example, might benefit from airing competing analyses and forecasts. So whatever those issues are, by differentiating more clearly, right, it seems to me that we strengthen the case for collaboration in those areas where it's truly necessary for achieving financial stability and development goals. So finally, I'd offer the observation that bank fund collaboration should be important to scholars because it's the most hopeful case of institutional collaboration in global governance, it seems to me. So the two institutions, after all, let's remember, were created at the same conference in 1944 by the same countries, right? And they have overlapping memberships. They share the same street in the same city, right? And the same working language. And the managing director and the director of SPR just very recently came from the upper ranks of World Bank management into the fund. So if ever we could expect good collaboration between two institutions, right? If ever there were a gold standard for collaboration between multilateral organizations, I think we have the right to expect the bank and the fund should represent that standard. So with that, I rest my case, and I look forward to the comments of my co-panelists and our discussion.
Thank you, Randy. One of the exciting things I learned during my year at the IEO was there's a joint choir and a joint class and a joint tunnel, an underground tunnel that connects them. So there are many, many layers of areas where they connect. I'll turn the floor now over to Bessma.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to the IEO for this great invitation, and I'm really excited to be here. I guess for those who might know some of my work, I come from a tradition of those who study international organizations from a cultural perspective. And I think it's really important. I'm going to just lay my case for sort of thinking about this a little more in terms of cultural aspects. But before I do, one of the things that, and I have to admit, I did write something on this, so I'm going to lean on my own publication on this, but it was really refreshing to look back at some of the literature on cooperation between the IMF and the World Bank. And it's very interesting because there's actually quite a bit of economic studies that show cooperation is really beneficial for the client, for countries. In fact, just to cite a number of them, one using a panel of 128 developing countries over almost 20 years, found that when the IMF or the World Bank works alone in a country, per capita GDP growth rates do not increase. In contrast, countries with simultaneous IMF and World Bank programs show a significant and positive relationship with economic expansion. Another one also took a look at this and found with a very sort of almost micro-level data or analysis looking at four developing countries, found that when they did work together, they found improved programming, better results, and even seeing through the programs. So I think it's really important, I think, and it doesn't quite come out in the study, but it may be even something for future work. Really, if you're going to have this argument of the need for collaboration, I think it really should start with almost the economic case, right? That this is really beneficial to the clients that the IMF and the World Bank serve. As Miles pointed out, it's framed in terms of efficiency, which is really important, of course, but also I think there's another sort of broader development argument that would be really beneficial to really lay out, because I think at the end of the day, that's really the interest of both the IMF and World Bank staff, is to raise the level of development in these countries. Now, the challenge I have, and I'm going to again make the pitch that, again, from this tradition that I come from, which is sort of a mixture of international organizational behavior literature or constructivist literature. I know we have some of the students from your university, Tammy, so I'm going to, hopefully some of your students are paying attention. For the constructivists, and I come from this tradition of looking at, culture within these organizations. It's really important now, and again, as a hammer sees a nail, for an international, someone who focuses on international organizations' culture, I'm going to say it matters. But I think in this particular case, I'm going to make the case that it's really fundamental. And of course, as Tammy noted, yes, there's these joint yoga classes and this underground tunnel, but also let's not forget here the broader outside or external perception is that these are the Bretton Woods twins, right? That's the literature, right? It's really talking about this joint history as though they're two of the same. The one thing I realized, having been at the IEO and working so much with colleagues at the IMF and the World Bank and interviews, is how different they are and how they very much view themselves as very different. And that's a structural challenge that I don't know how much you can overcome it. I appreciate the recommendations of working towards, trying to push the envelope on this, but I am going to throw out this question of whether or not it's doable. If you take my premise that culture is important, and these two organizations, which I think anybody that is listening who has experience working either in these organizations or with them would argue that they both see themselves as very different. In fact, the quote that I use is that they're more like, rivaling siblings, right? Rather than Bretton Woods twins. And that's, that's a different, just like, two members of a family, yes, they share this common, parentage of the Bretton Woods Conference, but at the same time, they're not the same people, right? They're not the same. And that's really important, I think, moving forward. So in looking at this, microdynamics at play, before I say that, one last thing I want to say, one thing that I think organizational behavior literature points out, and this is really steeped in business management literature, you can sort of look at some of the literature on mergers and acquisitions. It's a great sort of literature to go into because that's really where you see this, right? And you think about sort of the Chrysler and Mercedes, merger. It's a great case study that's often repeated because it's, taking two different organizations. What happens when you try to fuse them? So the business community has really done a great job of really, I think, building the academic literature on this. So I'm going to lean on them quite a bit. But one thing I think we need to start off with is that collaboration is hard. This is really important, right? I like Miles' analogy of academia. Being in senior administration, I definitely know what he's referring to. It is really difficult when you have, different interests. There's a rivalry. You don't necessarily have always the same sort of goals and objectives. And I would actually posit that the IMF and the World Bank similarly don't have the same goals and objectives. And this may be, again, a structural feature that just can't be overcome. So on that, let's think about this. And again, I'm leaning on some of my own past research on this. And what I want to say here is that this is really looking at sort of factors that you can look for when trying to sort of understand what is the basis of success for two organizations that are different. And often it's this idea of shared information and knowledge. That's a really good, important way of testing whether or not there's cultural similarity. We know that also bringing in questions of mutual trust. That's a really important variable that's been proven. Do you trust each other? And there's ways to measure that. And I think some of the research that I know my colleagues have done and that I've looked at too at the IMF and the World Bank that test this, in fact, shows that actually that's really just not the case. You don't have that mutual trust. Again, I'm going to keep hitting this point that's kind of depressing, that you may not be able to overcome this. This is just something that's embedded in the structure of these two organizations. And I'm going to just keep quoting some great quotes that I've found over the years. This is from an IMF study. When it talks about the IMF and the World Bank, it says the fundamental difference is this. The bank is primarily a development institution. The IMF is a cooperative institution that seeks to maintain an orderly system of payments and receipts between nations. Totally different goals. And Kruger, who we all know, Kruger highlighted that the cultural divergence between these two institutions, as she frames it, is that the IMF deals with countries in crisis, right? So they have a short-term thinking about how they deal with countries, where the World Bank provides loans to projects and is seen more as a friend of developing countries. Already you can see that they have very different objectives. You can almost argue, and I hate to say this, but where the IMF, you think about the IMF staff going to a developing country, it's oh no, the IMF staff is here, right? Whereas when the World Bank comes to see a developing country, it's like, oh, the IMF is here. Oh, sorry, the World Bank is here. It's a very different perception when these two organizations deal with a client. And that, again, it's not something that can be overcome. It's a big structural feature. The other thing is that the World Bank, of course, as I said, has this longer time horizons. So that means bank staff will exhibit patience, right? Their willingness for best solutions to emerge, rather than the most convenient. In contrast, the IMF, because they focus on crisis management, they're often, the firefighter that's come to sort of extinguish the flames that are burning at the immediate moment, has a short-term horizon. And so they have very different coming into a relationship with a country. And that is different. I think that is, again, structural, that really can't be changed. And so you see, and I personally had a chance to sort of do some research on this. This was often the vote of contention between the IMF and the World Bank on mission, right? So often the IMF was like, we need quick action, we need to prioritize things. And the IMF staff, in some of their words, were frustrated with the World Bank coming in for brainstorming. Or to have, or to build strategy. They just wanted to get things done, whereas the World Bank had this long-term kind of vision. Again, these are structural features that I'm questioning as to whether or not we can really overcome. Again, other situations here is that the IMF values efficiency, objectivity, data-driven technocratic decision-making, whereas the World Bank has a more larger and diverse staff and is more open to process and multiple views. So, again, they come from a very different, I think, backgrounds and tendencies. And it's, at the end of the day, it's staffing, also the IMF brings in mostly macroeconomists. The World Bank is a little more open. I mean, I've heard, as again, unfortunately, an IMF staff say to me in frustration, I don't want to talk to an anthropologist of the World Bank about this. We need to sort of extinguish the fire. I need to help get this country, back on its feet. And here you have the World Bank with their lofty goals who want to, go, sorry, this is now no longer politically correct, go native, and spend time with, the villagers to sort of understand how they operate. Again, I'm not trying to paint a bad picture of the IMF World Bank staff. I really just want to emphasize the point that, can you really get these two organizations to work together when they're so different culturally? I'm skeptical. And that is a bigger challenge, and again, frankly, too big for the IEO to fix or the board to fix. It is cultural change, it's socialization of staff, it's building new norms and priorities. And certainly the IMF is not my grandfather's IMF, as they say, because it's a very different organization today that is far more concerned with issues like gender equity, like the environment, things that frankly 20 years ago you would never see mentioned in an IMF document. But is the IMF staff and the IMF as a culture or an organization, speaking the same language as the World Bank today? I still have my reservations, and I'll end it there. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you very much, Bessma. I think this is a good way to start our discussion. So just as a reminder, you're welcome to raise your hand. There's a little hand you can click on, or you're welcome to post a question in the chat box. There's a couple in the queue already, but I think this is a good place to start for the panelists, for Michael, whether you think these different structures and cultures really make it especially challenging. You know, how do we improve collaboration given the issues that Bessma raises? So anyone like to answer? Yes, Michael.
Yeah, I can have a go. Yeah, I think Bessma is absolutely right in that the cultures of the two organizations are different in many ways, and that is going to be a deep and fundamental challenge to effective collaboration. Absolutely agreed. And also, as Bessma says, that to some extent comes from the differences in the purposes of the two institutions, because they do have common interests, but they also have distinct roles. So that is going to, create challenges for collaboration. I think one point to make is that obviously within each institution, and particularly within the bank, there are different cultures. So I think one area where it seemed that collaboration generally works more smoothly was between the fund and those bits of the bank that are dominated by macroeconomists, essentially. Because then you're talking about two organizations where the protagonists share a common language and conceptual framework. So there are areas where the cultures are less or aspects of the culture are less different. And then, of course, you have the potential that the macroeconomists in the bank who, understand fund and the way the fund thinks, they can be the bridge, if you like, between the fund and other bits of the bank. So that's one way to address that deep-seated challenge. I think the other point I'd say is that, and I think you did absolutely acknowledge this, Bessma, but culture isn't fixed. Obviously, it's very difficult to change, and it can take a long time to change. But it's not immutable. And the fund, one of the downsides of the fund's culture is a kind of, if you like, characterized as a sort of regimented, almost military mindset. And that in some ways doesn't help people to look outside and collaborate with others. But on the other hand, the sort of flip side of that trait is that the organization tends to do, or is perhaps more inclined to do, what the top of the organization tells it to do. So there is scope, I think, for relatively short-term impact to change culture through the messaging from the top of the institution. And we've already seen quite a big shift, for example, in the fund staff approach to climate change, which very much reflects the different priority that the new managing director has put on that issue as opposed to her predecessor. So, culture is slow and difficult to change, but can be changed. Let me just stop there and let others chip in on this issue.
Very good. I also think our audience can answer the questions, right, and comment. And I see we have in our audience one of the collaboration Sherpas, which is Jeff Chelsky. Jeff, do you have a comment on this particular thing or a different question? Hopefully you can unmute yourself, or we can unmute Jeff Chelsky in the audience. Maybe while we're trying to do that, do any of the other panelists want to respond to this question? Well, there's Jeff. He's showing up.
I am unmuted.
Great.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think part of the challenge is that what determines good collaboration is so multifaceted. It's language. I mean, there are different vocabularies. It's culture. I used to say that at the bank, everything is prohibited. Everything is permitted unless it's explicitly prohibited, and at the fund, everything's prohibited unless it's explicitly permitted. And those two approaches don't really work. There's the turf issue on issues like gender. On incentives, this is, I think, one of the most complicated ones. I forget who said that it was somehow in the client's interest for the bank and the fund to collaborate. often, particularly in the context of negotiation, it's in the client's interest to split the bank and the fund. They play one off the other. So depending on the context, you don't know what they're going to do. And then the other thing to remember is there's a membership issue. 1/3 of IMF governors are central banks, not governments. And while the central banks will always bow to the government in the end, there is some space there for maneuver. And I've seen fund and bank boards, same country groupings, take different positions on key issues because of that factor. And so having a joint meeting of the board, that's been done. Apparently, it was the most agonizing and useless session because nobody was really talking to one another, let alone in the particular, even colleagues across countries. But the last point I would make is and I think Bessma said, it's the trust issue, right? You're not going to work with someone you don't trust. And I thought that the best thing that ever happened to bank fund collaboration was when the fund started to downsize before the global financial crisis, a lot of fund people crossed over to the bank. And some of those people have subsequently moved back. And so you've got people who've moved between the two institutions. They know each other, they know the systems, they trust each other, and they speak the same language. That has improved collaboration in so many areas. And so I wonder if Shayla and Kristalina, having made that crossover, will in the end probably do more for bank fund collaboration than anything else. I'll stop there.
Very good. Thanks, Jeff. I want to raise an issue that's in the chat box, and it's something that Miles raised, and it's a comment from Carrie Korhonen, and it's this idea that when you're trying to leverage expertise, do you have to have a certain level of in-house expertise? You know, how do you draw that line? So if now the fund is seeking, because it doesn't have enough in-house leverage expertise, it needs to go out and leverage it. But if you don't have any in-house expertise or a very low level, you may not know how to judge the expertise you're getting. It could be off-the-shelf conditionality or something like this. And this is a point that Miles raised as well. You know, where do you draw the line? How much in-house expertise is enough expertise? So that's who would like to answer that?
So Tammy, I would just add to my previous comment, an interesting question for those who are here from the fund or the bank is, within an area like climate, thinking about what in that very big area does one institution do better than the other? In other words, what would specialization look like, mutually beneficial specialization? Because I'm a bit more optimistic than Bessma was about, you know, there's a big spectrum between Cain and Abel among siblings and identical twins. You know, there are families that get along reasonably well, and you know, specialization, having expertise that is valued by the other side, doesn't mean you do the same thing. It means you're working on the same problem, but in different ways that you both see as mutually beneficial. And I just don't know what that would look like. Obviously, on financial sector issues, as the report indicates, that has been worked out reasonably well, I think. And can you expand that to some of these macrostructural issues, which are really very broad and very, I must say, kind of vague? I mean, inequality. I mean, that's an issue we'll be working on for centuries, probably. So, what is it that concretely these institutions could do that would be mutually beneficial? And that does mean that the fund would have to build up expertise, probably in areas that it has relatively limited expertise just now.
Thank you, Miles. I want to bring in a question from Chiara Mariotti from Eurodad, and she asks whether the review of the collaboration also took into consideration the views and assessment of the recipient of collaboration, country governments and officials. Can I turn that question over to Michael?
Sure, yeah, good question. The short answer is yes, but perhaps not as much as it could have done. The yes part of the answer is that we were quite extensive in our engagement with the fund's executive directors, who, as people will know, represent the entire membership. So I think we did get via directors and their staff in their offices a perspective from the countries, if you like, about how well they felt bank fund collaboration worked or didn't work in those areas that we looked at. The way in which perhaps we didn't do as much of that as we might have done was that we didn't really engage with authorities much beyond via executive directors' offices. We did speak to a handful of officials based in countries, and we did get some interesting and useful insights from those people that we approached. But part of the challenge was really identifying across obviously with a large number of countries, people at the right level who, on the one hand, were senior enough to kind of take a strategic and broader perspective, but on the other hand, to have actually had kind of experience of the nitty-gritty experience of working with the fund and the bank. And it's actually quite hard to identify particular officials who fall into that the intersection of those two groups. The other thing to say is, as I mentioned, this was a shorter evaluation, and one of the things that if we'd undertaken this topic in the context of one of our longer-term 2-year evaluations, then we probably would have done a survey of country officials, which is more standard practice for IEO evaluations, as I say, for the full or longer format evaluations. So I think I hope that's answered that question.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'd like to call on Emma Burgesser. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I understand you had your hand up. I didn't see it. So if you can unmute and please ask your question.
No worries. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks so much. This is Emma Burgesser with the Bretton Woods Project. Thank you so much for your presentations. I found the report really useful to better understand how fund staff are approaching collaboration on macrostructural issues. And for those of you that know me, you'll know that I'm particularly interested in the collaboration with organizations other than the bank, which we haven't talked about so much here today. And I thought the finding that the collaboration with them was often deeper and more meaningful than with the bank, particularly important actually, and sort of worth highlighting. I have just a few questions specifically for Michael or the IEO. First, so I realized in relation to the first recommendation, the report highlights a framework on climate change, but am I correct in understanding that the report effectively also recommends that the IMF at least explores developing a specific concrete framework for collaboration with UN Women on gender issues? And if so, can we expect maybe a dedicated MOU to be developed between these organizations, because the board seems to have agreed with the recommendations? And second, in relation to the UN, I missed any reference in the report to the Office of the IMF Special Representative to the UN. I was wondering how you conceptualize the role of that office in these recommendations. Should they be leading on developing these collaboration frameworks, or should their capacity be strengthened to do that because they're so small? And then, sorry, final question. On the point that was alluded to a bit in terms of the findings of the report on the collaboration not necessarily improving efficiency or saving costs, and the findings about the cooperation with DFID seeming relatively successful, I was wondering if any conclusions have been drawn at the board on the implications for future funding of these work streams. Was there any board discussion about pursuing more of these bilateral agreements or rethinking the flat operational budget targets of the fund? I'm asking this particularly, of course, in the context of the upcoming comprehensive surveillance review and what might happen to these issues there. And finally, just because you mentioned this is the first time the IEO is doing this shorter evaluation, I was just wondering on your thoughts on how you feel that went in relation to your longer evaluations, and will you be doing more of these short ones in future? Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emma. Those are great questions, but quite a few of them. So if you don't mind, I would say, Michael, please answer what you can, because we do have some other people in the queue and we have 10 minutes left.
Sure, I'll try and be brief. I might leave Emma's final question. Perhaps Charles might want to speak to that when Charles gets a chance. So, no, the first question about explicitly recommending a framework with UN Women around gender issues. No, we don't explicitly mention that. I mean, we make the more general point that we think the fund needs to look across the range of its work, obviously including gender, and identify which areas it thinks are likely to give the greatest net returns to collaboration. So that, of course, doesn't exclude the fund reaching a conclusion in consultation with UN Women that that is an area that they both feel would benefit from a more structured approach. And indeed, as we say in the report, that did seem to be one area where collaboration had worked well. And I think that was primarily about the fact that there was very little sense of competition between the fund's work on gender and the work of UN Women in the African countries that we heard about. Very, very complementary roles with little kind of competition. In contrast to some of the more competitive tensions that seem to exist between or within the fund's sort of global practice on gender, where I think they felt that there was more of an overlap and a bit of a sense of, you know, we've been thinking about these issues for a long, long time. Who are the fund to come and tell us to start working for them or tell us how to do our jobs? You asked about the role of the fund's UN representative. That's not an issue that we focused on. Again, I think it would come out of that structured exercise that we are recommending, that the fund looks across the piece, decides where it should be focusing its efforts in terms of more structured collaboration. And if one of the conclusions is greater collaboration with the UN or aspects of the UN, then I'm sure the fund's representative at the UN would be important to implementing that. And then the question about funding, another good question. We do say a little bit about that in our recommendations. Nothing very specific, but that clearly funding can make a difference, as in the sense of looking into the possibility of funding that's specifically focused on particular collaboration areas, like the DFID work that has funded parts of the fund to do more research on macroeconomics in low-income countries. So that again could be part of the broader picture. So let me leave it there.
Thanks, Michael. We have a question from Sargon Nisan for Randy Henning. And the comment in question is, having participated in the original consultation by the IEO on adopting this topic, we in civil society were motivated to push for this evaluation, partly to unpack the way that the IMF's junior status in the EU crisis troika exposed long-standing governance shortfalls in the fund. This isn't something the evaluation ultimately addressed, although it was touched upon in its evaluation of the IMF's response to the EU crisis. Would Professor Henning expand on his allusion to these issues in light of the challenges this evaluation found the IMF confronts when seeking to collaborate with other financial institutions, not just its sibling organization?
Well, thanks for the question. This case of the Troika is indeed really interesting, because I would say this is the case of the IMF's most intense collaboration with other organizations, right? I mean, so this was a period when the stakes were high, the amount of money was large, right, and the consequences for member countries were deep, right, and expansive. So as far as kind of the junior status of the quote unquote junior status of the fund in this regime complex, right, for the Euro crisis is concerned, I wish, I had you all along in the conversation that I've had in other contexts, where people have attributed kind of dominance to the International Monetary Fund in this set of episodes, right? as the leading or even a hegemonic institution at the top of the hierarchy. And I think that it's neither subordinate it was neither subordinate to the European institutions, nor was it dominant in the European cluster of institutions. These were institutions. These institutions had equal status, and the member countries, especially the creditor states in Europe, were able to maneuver among them in such a way as to turn the outcome to their advantage. And so I think one lesson from this, right, is that our focus on collaboration shouldn't be our analysis of collaboration shouldn't be too focused on just the interaction between management and staff of the two institutions. It really does have to be grounded in the preferences and the strategies of the members. Okay, and here I would emphasize those members that have exercised particular influence over the governance of the institutions. So that's one of the big takeaways kind of from the fund's experience in the Euro crisis for collaboration in other issues and for collaboration with other institutions besides the World Bank, whether it's the UN organizations or the OECD or the regional financial arrangements.
We have time for one more question from my colleague at SAS, Arturo Porzakansky, and then Charles will make some closing comments. Arturo?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say that I really like the four main recommendations of the report, and especially I see that the board of the fund has welcomed them and agreed. So that's doesn't get any better than that. But the first and most important recommendation, which is that instead of updating various umbrella agreements, really what should be sought out are topic-specific agreements, and I agree very much with that. I just want to emphasize why this is so important. It's very important because in the olden days, it was very clear. The World Bank's role was to deal with, let's call them infrastructure deficits, and the IMF's role was to deal with balance of payments deficits. So there was a clear division of responsibility and a clear division of labor. But in recent years, as not only the goalposts have moved, but the goals have been changed. So now corruption, environmental sustainability, gender balance, economic inequality, climate change, and so on and so forth have been added to the list. And I think right now it's very unclear where the division of labor lies. And that's why these agreements are very important, because I think it'd be a waste of taxpayer money to, for both institutions to hire inequality experts and climate experts and gender experts and so on, when the whole goal should be to move ahead in a cost-effective, highly productive manner. So division of labor is what these specific agreements should look for. And climate change is a great one, but the other ones too.
Thank you, Arturo, for that comment. I can only add that from my history of collaboration, I can say that even in the olden days, the responsibilities overlapped. Even in the 1940s, they were worried about this, but it's true, it's gotten worse over time. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a question for Bessma on whether there are success stories in the literature of institutions that have learned to collaborate better over time. Are there any lessons that could help this case?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Prakash. I see that. Thank you so much. It's a great question. I don't think I have necessarily, organizations that are stellar at this, because I think it's what the literature would say is really that these organizations tend to be different because they have different histories. They recruit different, they socialize different, they have different incentives. But in terms of mechanics, what's often been said that works is having sometimes a joint almost unit that's responsible to ensure that this collaboration works. I mean, I think of it as sort of, at some point there needs to be responsibility, right? I mean, who in the organization, this is where I think some would even argue in the conversation about collaboration between the IMF and the World Bank, if the organizations almost pay lip service to it. It's in all the documents. It's said, obviously that these two organizations should work together. But let's be honest, is there punishment or incentives for either the IMF or the World Bank staff? I'm using words not to be, draconian, but I'm just trying to get the point across. Are either of these staff members going to be either rewarded or punished if they don't cooperate with each other? I mean, accountability, right, is the core of the issue. At the end of the day, if you want something done, there needs to be some consequences. And that's the challenge. The challenge is actually you don't have either those incentives or disincentives to collaborate. So you can put those in place. And certainly I think that, increasingly you find it, for example, in the Article 4 agreement, there is a section called IMF World Bank staff, right? Commentary. That's really helpful because you're sort of forcing them to put together some commentary. That always is useful. So, reporting, and I know for the IMF, a little better than the World Bank culture, but, the IMF just loves to have things on paper, right, to actually report it. And so incentivizing that so that, this is, yes, coming back from, I think that the missions, for example, is a great place, so the return to office memo. Where is the section on the points of agreement with the World Bank? Where are there points of disagreement? I mean, documenting it is really helpful. And you start to build, I think, a conversation. So, for example, is there a post-return to Washington meeting? I don't think there is, but there should be, right? It should be part of the structure that when the two organizations go on mission, and often they are going on mission together, they don't just sort of work on the report, in the hotel room or on the plane, that there's actually a follow-up conversation with the two members of these teams to actually iron out their differences. Again, I'd love for people who are really on the inside to say that I'm wrong, but I don't think they're actually necessarily purposely needing to get on the same page both before and after their missions to these countries, for example.
Well, we are out of time now, and I want to turn this over to Charles to tie everything up, but I personally want to thank the panelists and also the members of the audience for asking such good questions and launching this conversation. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all the excellent questions, but I hope people were able to read everything in the chat box. So turning it over to you, Charles.
Much, Tammy, and thanks to all of our panelists and to Michael as well. I find it a really interesting, very rich discussion, particularly sort of getting this very thought-provoking, high-level thoughts from our professors, really stretching our minds on these issues. I was struck by, I think each of you in your comments provided some pretty compelling reasons why collaboration is really difficult. That to some degree conflict is maybe in the interests of key shareholders of the organizations, that the organizations themselves are naturally competing hierarchies, jostling for space, and at the micro level that there are some profound cultural differences between the people who work for the two institutions. I think those are all true and worth thinking about. At the same time, I think there is room pragmatically to try to find ways to improve the collaboration. It's never going to be perfect for the reasons that you give, but I think there are mechanisms to strengthen collaboration. And we were struck that our basic conclusion is that collaboration is uneven. In some cases, it actually works quite well. In other cases, it works much less well. And we try to draw lessons from the differences to suggest what concrete changes might be used to improve collaboration on really critical issues like climate inequality and gender. And I think the four recommendations that we make would all, if implemented with conviction, make a difference. the idea of having a tailored framework that lays out responsibilities for who does what and how to work together in areas of overlap. And I think there are increasingly areas of overlap. We're no longer in a world in which the issues can be simply divided between the fund and bank. Steps to improve the incentives for the staff in the two institutions to work together, to understand what's in it for them to collaborate. The need for greater information sharing, it's not something we've discussed about very much, but I think one of the most striking conclusions of the report is the barriers to information sharing between the two institutions in a world in which certainly the bank, and I think the fund too, regards itself as a knowledge-based organization. Not to be sharing knowledge effectively is really not satisfactory. And then finally, leadership, the importance of leadership from the managing director, the president, and the two boards and shareholders. What we now need to see is what impact the report will have. We're looking forward to the implementation plan that will be emerging. Basically, management staff have 6 months to put together an implementation plan, so hopefully that will be ready by May. I think part of the implementation plan will be moving forward with some of the conclusions of the comprehensive surveillance review, which is also going to be concluded in the spring. And that does grapple with some of the issues on bank fund collaboration, drawing on the lessons from our report. So I think we can have an impact there. And then there's a big issue of the budget, which was raised by I think it was Emma. I think as the fund is being asked to do more and more things, I think it has become a real question whether the fund has the resources, both human resources and financial resources, to deliver on what its members expected to deliver on. And that's an issue that's also going to be discussed and addressed. I mean, clearly, it's a matter for the shareholders to deliberate how much do they really believe in this expansive vision of the fund. Do they believe in it to the extent that they're prepared to put the money that's required to deliver on it? And I think one of the key messages from the evaluation is that collaboration is not a cost-saving device. It doesn't miraculously allow the fund and the bank to deliver on a much broader mandate. It's something that needs additional resources, not less resources. I think that's important. Finally, let me just respond to the question about the experience with a shorter evaluation. I think it was in general a very positive experience, and congratulations to Michael and the team for pulling it off. We delivered what I think was an effective, convincing report within a shorter period of time than usual. So this shorter evaluation format, I think, does provide us with a way of being more nimble and responding to challenges. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that there are clearly trade-offs involved. And as Michael mentioned, we didn't have the time to consult extensively with country authorities. We took the shortcut of talking with executive directors. I think if we had looked at more detail at some of the other areas of collaboration, that would also been useful and would have helped us to develop our advice on how to strengthen collaboration. So recognizing these trade-offs, we do have to think carefully about what is the appropriate approach to take in the future. But certainly the shorter evaluation does look to be a useful instrument to have in our toolbox. And right now, in fact, we're beginning to think about our future evaluations and what is the appropriate format for them. And we will be posting in a few days a menu of possible options. So I recommend to people watching in on the seminar to watch out on our website or sign up to be on our distribution list to get a copy of the menu of options that we're now considering. let me end there. I think it's really been a great discussion. We will post it, as I promised at the beginning, on our website, and really appreciate the time of everybody, but in particular the time from our panelists and from Tammy, our moderator, coming back to help us after contributing so much to the original evaluation. So thanks so much, everybody, and hope to stay in touch. Goodbye.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.